Hey everyone, so I welcome you to this channel, and in this tutorial video we will learn how to create CRUD based REST API application with H2 database using our Spring Boot framework. And I've already created a video like explaining how to set up the H2 database in Spring Boot, explaining on what is H2 database. So if you are someone who is trying to learn about H2 database, you can go and watch that video first, because this video it is going to be entirely hands-on. We will create a simple CRUD based Spring Boot application using our H2 database. Okay, so let's just quickly get started. In this tutorial we will see what is CRUD. We will understand the application architecture that we will be building. We will quickly have a look at the annotations that we will be using. Then we will create our project and import it in our IDE. We will add the layers like the model, the controller, the service, the repository, or the DAO layer, and then we will execute the application. And once running, we will test our application by performing the CRUD operations. Okay, so let's get started. So first, let me quickly go through on what is CRUD. So CRUD, it basically stands for create, read, update, delete. And this acronym, it identifies all the major functions that are inherent to a relational database and the applications used to manage them, which includes Oracle DB or the SQL DB and others. These four CRUD operations, that is create, read, update, delete, can perform all the different types of operation on selected data within the database that I'm using. And CRUD operations we do use widely in many applications that are supported by underlying relational databases. So let's quickly go through all the CRUD operations individually. So the C stands for create. It allows users to create a new record in the database. R stands for read, and it is similar to search function. It allows users to search and retrieve specific records in the table and read their values. U stands for update. It is used to modify existing records that are in the database. And D, it stands for delete. And as the name dignifies, it is used to remove records from a database. Now we will see the application architecture, like what we will be building, what are all the layers that we need. So first we will need a model class, and the model class, it represents a Java object which carries data basically, and the entities defined in this class are either saved or fetched from the database. We will need a controller class that will be responsible for processing our incoming REST API requests. We will need a service class in which we will define our business logic, and also we'll need a repository interface. The repository that we will be using is the JPA repository, and the JPA repository provides some of the useful methods to perform the database operations such as create, read, update, delete. And in this tutorial we will be making use of the JPA repository, and the annotations that we'll be using, we will be using @entity annotation, which will be defined on top of our model class. We'll be using @id annotation, which will be used to specify that this column in my list of attributes will be used as an identifier object. We will use @table annotation to specify to my framework that when you are creating a table in the database, which is H2 database, you have to create a table using the name that I'm specifying in the @table annotation. And rest, like service, rest controller, these are class level annotations. @service we will be using in our service class. @rest controller we'll be using in our controller class. We'll be using all these mappings on the method levels, like the post mapping, the get mapping, the put mapping, and the delete mapping. And also at method level we'll be using @path variable and request body annotations. A step-by-step tutorial on what we will be doing for the hands-on goes like: we'll first create our application, we'll update the dependencies, and then we will configure our H2 database. Then we will create our model class, which is the entity. We will create our JPA repository interface. We will create a controller to handle requests. We'll also create the service class. We will then run the application and verify the CRUD operations in my H2 database as well as in my POSTMAN. Okay, so let's quickly get started. So I'll quickly jump onto the STS, which is Spring Tool Suite, to create the simple Spring Boot application. So we have already published a video on how to create Spring Boot applications from STS. you can watch that video or you can just follow along in this tutorial. So go to new and then Spring Starter project to provide a few details like the project name, the group ID, the artifact ID. So I'll just quickly go ahead and fill that. Okay, so now let's click on next and add the dependencies. So I'll be needing the H2 database, the Spring Data JPA and the Spring Web dependencies. These three dependencies are good to go for this tutorial. So once selected, we'll click on finish and it will take few seconds to build the project. Okay, so the project is built. Let's quickly just verify once the dependencies are added. So we have the Spring Starter Data JPA dependency, we have the Starter Web dependency, and also we have the H2 database dependency. So I'll quickly go ahead and configure my H2 database, which is just specifying a few properties in the application properties file. Okay, so I have pasted the properties that I need to configure the H2 database. The console H2 console is enabled to be true. We have the data source URL. We have the username. We have the password. We have the show SQL set to be true so that I can verify the SQL commands that are running behind the scene. Okay, so the application properties looks good. So we can just run our application once to verify whether my H2 database is configured or not. So I'll go to my main class and click on this play button, select Spring Boot app. Okay. Okay, so the Tomcat has started on port 8080. Let's just quickly verify whether the S2 database is configured correctly or not. I will switch to my browser first and type in the URL localhost colon 8080 slash h2 hyphen console. So this password, it must be the same that you have given in your application properties file. And here I have specified to be password. So I'll just paste it. Things look good. Let's click on connect. Okay, so here I have to change the database name. Password. So yes, we are able to log into our H2 console. So that's good from the H2 configuration scenario. Now let's quickly implement the CRUD logic. So for that, I'll go to my STS, go back to my STS. Let's close all these tabs. And first we will create our model class, which is also the entity class. So we'll go here, right click, click on new and create a new class. So I'll keep it in a different package, the models package, and the name, let's suppose I will give in the consumer name. Okay, so click on finish. So we have created our consumer class. I'll quickly add in the attributes that I will be using. Okay, so I have created the model class. It is with the name consumer and we have fields like ID, name, address, plan, subscription status inside it. Quickly go ahead and format it. It looks good. So now coming to the annotation, we'll specify this class with the @entity annotation from jakarta.persistence API. And I will also be needing the table annotation so that I can specify the framework that we have to create the table with this name that I'm specifying in my database. It also comes from the jakarta.persistence and I will have to provide the name. Name consumer looks good. And I will use this ID as the unique identifier in my database. And I will annotate this field with @ID annotation, and also I will use generated value. So this generated value annotation, it provides the strategy for generating the values for this ID attribute. Okay, so our model class is ready. Now let's quickly go ahead and create my repository interface. Go ahead and click on new, select interface from here, given the name. So I will extend the JPA repository, and in the generics, in the generic parameters, we have to provide the model class as the parameter and the ID, the data type of the ID that I'm using. So my model class is consumer consumer, and the ID that I'm using, it is of type long. So long, this looks good. So our repository is also created. Quickly format this and save this. Now we need to create the service class where we will implement the logic. So I'll go and click on new, create a new class in a different package, and I will name this as consumer service. So the service class is created. First things first, let's annotate it with service annotation. Now I will be auto wiring the repository that I have created so that I'm able to use the functionalities that are defined in my consumer repository, which is also extending the JPA repository. Okay, so auto wired consumer repository. Now let's create one by one all the CRUD methods that I will be implementing in this application. So we have created our service class. Let's quickly go through. We have auto-wired the repository that we have created, and we have added four methods: the save consumer, get all consumers, get consumer by a particular ID, and then delete consumer. So the save consumer, it will take the consumer as the request body, the consumer details, and it will save that in the database. Get all consumers, it will fetch all the consumers that are present in the database which I have created or which I have saved. Get consumer by a particular ID, based on a single particular ID, it will fetch the details of a single consumer. And delete consumer, it will delete a particular consumer based on the ID parameter. So my service class looks good. Now let's go ahead and create the last logic, our controller class. So I'll quickly go ahead and create the controller class. Now let's get done with the annotation. So controller class, basic annotation, REST controller. Okay, so I will be needing the service class that I've just created. So I will go ahead and auto wire it. Consumer service. Now I will implement all the individual methods one by one. So we will create post mapping, get mapping, and the delete mapping methods. So let's create the post mapping method to save the consumer to a database. Post mapping, and I will use the path in here like save consumer. Okay, so I have also created the controller class. Let's quickly go through and then we will run our application and verify. So the first thing, we have annotated with REST controller, and since I will be needing an object of the consumer service class, I have auto wired consumer service, and then we have created four methods. So first is the post mapping, which will save my consumer object details to the database. Then we have get all consumers, which will fetch the details of all the consumers that are saved in the database. Then we have the get consumer based on a particular ID that I'm providing in the URL itself, and I have fetched that using the @path variable annotation. Also, we have the delete consumer based on a particular ID. It will delete that consumer from my database. So yeah, things look good now. We are done with implementing all the layers. We have created the model class. We have created the DAO interface. We have created our service layer and also the controller layer. So now let's quickly go and verify our application. Let's run our application first. So I'll go to my main class and click on this play button. So some things are happening in console. Let's double click. So we can see that the Tomcat has started on port 8080. So first I will verify whether my S2 console is running or not. It has TB and password. We have given password in the application properties. Click on connect. Okay, so we have our S2 console connected and we can see that we have a database with the name of consumers. So if I go ahead and run it now, it will show me empty since we do not have saved any details, any consumer details in my database yet. So let's quickly go and do that. So for that, I will need my Postman application. Let's click on create a new worksheet, and in here, let's first use the post mapping. Colon 8080 slash consumer slash create consumer. Let's verify whether we have used the correct URL mapping or not. So we have the save consumer. Okay. So now coming to the body part, click on this body and go to raw. And from this drop down, we have to select JSON so that we can give the JSON data as the input. So let's fetch some consumer details. So I have some handmade data with me. So I'll just copy that and paste it in here. So slash save consumer post mapping, and we have the body. Okay, let's click on send and see. So we are getting the status that consumer is saved. So first I will go and verify that in my H2 console whether the consumer has been saved or not. Okay, so we can see that when I do a select star from my consumers database, one record is being displayed. That means our save consumer was successful. So I'll quickly implement a few more saves. I'll quickly create few more consumers, post mapping slash save consumer, and in the body we'll give the consumer details. Click on send. Consumer has been saved, and just one more. Click on send. So the consumer has been saved. If I go to my H2 console and do a select star from my consumers table again, we can see that we have 3 records, and we have saved 3 records from my slash save consumer through the Postman API. Okay, so things are good for the post mapping that we have just created. Now I will try for the get mapping. So I'll quickly just copy this URL so that I can use it in my get mapping. And we have a different mapping for my get mapping method. So we have first get all consumers, and once I paste it, I have this get selected from this drop down. Click on send. Okay, so we are seeing that we are getting the details of all the 3 consumers that I have saved. So this get mapping, like get mapping for get all consumers, that is also working fine as per my expectation. So now I will use the get mapping for the get consumer by based on a particular ID. So I'll verify the URL mapping for that slash get consumer slash ID. So I'll just copy this and I will feed in an ID. Like let's suppose I give in here 2. Click on send. Okay, I think we have a double slash here. Now if I click on send, I'm also getting the details of the consumer with ID 2 as was our requirement. If I click on 3, it will give me the details of consumer with ID 3. Okay, so the get mapping is also working for a particular ID. Now let's quickly verify our delete mapping, whether that works or not. So from this drop down, I'll click on delete, copy this URL, and in here I will paste the delete URL and I will modify this. So what was my mapping for delete? It was slash delete consumer. And I will also have to provide in the ID, like for which ID I'm trying to delete. So let's suppose I give in 3 and click on send. Now it gives me nothing, but we can see here that the status is okay. Now let's quickly go into my get and do a get of all 3 consumers. So first we had 3 consumer details. Now let's see what details do I have when I click on send. So now we can see that we have 2 consumers in my database, and since I have deleted the third consumer from my database. So if I also go into my H2 console and verify it, we can see that we have 2 records in my database. So our delete mapping is also working fine. So we have checked the post mapping, we have checked the get mapping for get all consumers, We have checked the get mapping for a particular consumer, and we have also verified the delete consumer. So our CRUD based Spring Boot application using H2 database, it is working fine as per my expectation. And in this tutorial, we learned how we can create simple Spring Boot based CRUD application using H2 database. We learned quite a few things here. We learned how to configure H2 database. We learned how to create a model class. We learned the use of several annotations like entity, table, get mapping, post mapping, delete mapping, path variable, etc. And we also learned how we can create a DAO layer, a repository interface, which will extend the JPA repository so that we can use the methods that are already defined in my JPA repository interface. Okay, so yes, so with that, we come to an end of this tutorial. We checked on all these boxes: create simple Spring Boot application, update dependencies, create entity, create repository, create controller and service class, run the application, and verify the application. Okay, so I will see you in the next video where we will be learning more interesting things about Spring Boot technology. So if you have not subscribed to the channel, I will ask you to subscribe so that you don't miss any of the future videos. With that, let's end this tutorial. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.